When people talk about narcissistic harm, they often focus on the visible behaviors: denial, defensiveness, blame shifting, or cruelty. But underneath those behaviors sits something far less visible and far more destabilizing for the narcissistic individual: deep, unprocessed shame. This shame is not the same as remorse or guilt. Guilt allows reflection and repair. Shame, for a narcissistic person, is experienced as an attack on identity itself, an existential threat to the self-image they have carefully constructed to survive psychologically. This is why the topic of the shame narcissists carry after hurting you is not about excusing abuse or asking for empathy for harmful behavior. It is about understanding why accountability feels psychologically intolerable to them. Many narcissistic individuals are not unaware that they caused harm. On some level, they often know. But acknowledging that harm would force them to confront a version of themselves they cannot emotionally tolerate: flawed, vulnerable, or responsible for pain. That confrontation risks collapsing the fragile sense of superiority, innocence, or entitlement that keeps their inner world intact. In this discussion, we'll explore how shame fuels denial, minimization, gaslighting, and the constant externalization of blame. And we'll also talk about why waiting for admissions, insight, or apologies can keep survivors stuck when healing does not require the narcissist's acknowledgement to move forward. To understand why shame is so destabilizing for narcissistic individuals, it helps to first distinguish it from guilt. Guilt is behavior-focused. It allows a person to say, "I did something wrong," without collapsing their entire sense of self. Because guilt preserves the idea that someone can be flawed and still be worthy, it opens the door to accountability, repair, and change. Shame works very differently. Shame is identity-focused. It communicates, "I am wrong." And for many people, that feeling is uncomfortable but tolerable. For narcissistic personalities, however, shame is experienced as psychologically dangerous. Narcissistic identity is often built on a fragile self-structure that relies heavily on entitlement, superiority, or external validation to stay intact. Their sense of worth is not internally anchored. Instead, it depends on admiration, control, or being seen as exceptional. When shame enters the picture, it doesn't simply register as feedback. It threatens the entire structure holding the self together. This is why accountability doesn't feel corrective. It feels annihilating. Early developmental experiences often play a role here. Many narcissistic individuals grew up with conditional attachment, where love, safety, or approval were tied to performance, compliance, or image rather than emotional attunement. In those environments, mistakes were not opportunities for learning. They were moments of emotional danger. The child learns that being wrong risks abandonment, humiliation, or loss of connection. Over time, this creates profound shame intolerance. The adult narcissistic defenses, grandiosity, denial, projection, are not signs of strength but attempts to outrun that original vulnerability. From an emotional regulation perspective, shame is one of the most dysregulating affects. It floods the nervous system, activates threat responses, and overwhelms the capacity for reflection. Because narcissistic individuals lack stable internal soothing mechanisms, they cannot metabolize shame in a regulated way. Instead of processing it, they defend against it. This is where we see denial, minimization, rage, gaslighting, and blame shifting emerge so quickly. This dynamic explains why even mild feedback can provoke extreme reactions. A neutral comment, a boundary, or a simple statement of hurt may be perceived not as information, but as an accusation of worthlessness. The narcissistic system responds accordingly by attacking the source, rewriting reality, or insisting the problem lies elsewhere. These are not calculated strategies in the moment so much as automatic defenses designed to prevent internal collapse. Understanding this difference between guilt and shame helps clarify why expecting accountability from a narcissistic individual often leads to more harm. Their nervous system is not organized around repair, it is organized around survival. And when survival is at stake, truth becomes negotiable, empathy shuts down, and defenses take over. This is why the topic of the shame narcissists carry after hurting you is not about excusing abuse or asking for empathy for harmful behavior. It is about understanding why accountability feels psychologically intolerable to them. Many narcissistic individuals are not unaware that they caused harm. On some level, they often know. But acknowledging that harm would force them to confront a version of themselves they cannot emotionally tolerate: flawed, vulnerable, or responsible for pain. That confrontation risks collapsing the fragile sense of superiority, innocence, or entitlement that keeps their inner world intact. In this discussion, we'll explore how shame fuels denial, minimization, gaslighting, and the constant externalization of blame. And we'll also talk about why waiting for admissions, insight, or apologies can keep survivors stuck, when healing does not require the narcissist's acknowledgement to move forward. Denial is one of the most misunderstood behaviors in narcissistic dynamics. It's often interpreted as lying, manipulation, or a refusal to tell the truth. And while those elements can be present, denial in narcissistic individuals is more accurately understood as a survival strategy rather than ignorance or simple deception. Its primary function is to block shame from reaching conscious awareness. When reality threatens the narcissistic self-image, denial steps in automatically to preserve psychological equilibrium. For many narcissistic individuals, denial is not a deliberate choice made after careful thought. It is fast, reflexive, and largely unconscious. The nervous system detects danger, being seen as harmful, flawed, or responsible, and the mind reorganizes reality to reduce that threat. This is why narcissistic denial can look so convincing. They are not always pretending in the way people assume. They often experience their version of events as true because it is emotionally safer than the alternative. Denial takes several recognizable forms. Rewriting history is common, where past events are altered or reframed to remove responsibility. Selective memory allows them to recall details that support innocence while forgetting moments that suggest harm. Emotional amnesia shows up when they remember what happened but disconnect from the emotional impact entirely. And dismissal of impact occurs when they acknowledge an action but invalidate its effect, insisting someone is too sensitive or misunderstanding what occurred. This is why presenting evidence rarely produces accountability. Facts, screenshots, timelines, or emotional explanations all require the narcissistic individual to sit with shame long enough to integrate it. That is precisely what their psychological system is organized to avoid. Logic does not override shame defenses. Emotional vulnerability does not soften them. In many cases, more proof simply escalates denial because the threat feels greater. The mind responds by strengthening its defenses, not lowering them. It's also important to understand that denial is not designed to protect the relationship. It protects the narcissist's internal balance. Admitting harm would destabilize their sense of self and expose them to emotions they cannot regulate. From that perspective, preserving their version of reality becomes more urgent than preserving trust, connection, or even honesty. This is why survivors often feel invisible in these conversations. Their pain is not being weighed equally against the narcissist's need for psychological safety. For survivors, recognizing denial as a defense rather than confusion can be clarifying. Confusion invites clarification and dialogue. Denial shuts those processes down. When someone is confused, new information helps. When someone is in denial, new information is experienced as an attack. Understanding this distinction can help survivors stop exhausting themselves trying to be clearer, calmer, or more persuasive in hopes of finally being understood. Denial in narcissistic dynamics is not a failure of communication. It is a structural limitation rooted in shame and intolerance. And seeing it clearly can help survivors redirect their energy away from proving their reality and toward protecting it. This is why the topic of the shame narcissists carry after hurting you is not about excusing abuse or asking for empathy for harmful behavior. It is about understanding why accountability feels psychologically intolerable to them. Many narcissistic individuals are not unaware that they caused harm. On some level, they often know. But acknowledging that harm would force them to confront a version of themselves they cannot emotionally tolerate, flawed, vulnerable, or responsible for pain. That confrontation risks collapsing the fragile sense of superiority, innocence, or entitlement that keeps their inner world intact. In this discussion, we'll explore how shame fuels denial, minimization, gaslighting, and the constant externalization of blame. And we'll also talk about why waiting for admissions, insight, or apologies can keep survivors stuck, when healing does not require the narcissist's acknowledgement to move forward. When outright denial can no longer hold, narcissistic defenses often shift into subtler but equally damaging forms: minimization and gaslighting. These strategies allow the narcissistic individual to acknowledge that something happened without fully confronting its meaning or impact. The goal remains the same: reduce exposure to shame. By shrinking the harm, they shrink the threat to their identity. Minimization typically sounds dismissive rather than overtly aggressive. Statements like, "You're too sensitive," or "You're overreacting," or "It wasn't that bad," serve a psychological function. They reframe the issue as the other person's emotional flaw rather than the narcissist's behavior. If the harm can be made small enough, then the narcissistic individual doesn't have to face the internal collapse that true accountability would bring. The pain exists, but it is redefined as insignificant, exaggerated, or imagined. Gaslighting goes a step further. While minimization reduces the size of the harm, gaslighting destabilizes the survivor's sense of reality altogether. It offloads shame by relocating it onto the other person's perception, memory, or mental stability. When a narcissistic individual says, "That never happened," or "You're remembering it wrong," they are not just avoiding responsibility, they are protecting themselves from the intolerable feeling of being the cause of harm. If reality itself can be questioned, then shame has nowhere to land. These defenses are especially corrosive because they target the survivor's internal world. Over time, repeated minimization teaches a person to doubt their emotional responses. Repeated gaslighting erodes trust in memory, intuition, and judgment. Survivors may begin to ask themselves whether they are too much, too dramatic, or fundamentally flawed for feeling hurt at all. This internalization of blame is one of the most lasting injuries of narcissistic dynamics. It's important to approach this topic with both clarity and realism. Minimization and gaslighting are not misunderstandings or communication styles. They are defensive maneuvers rooted in shame avoidance. At the same time, recognizing their function does not excuse the harm they cause. Understanding the mechanism helps survivors depersonalize the behavior, but it does not make the behavior acceptable. From an accountability standpoint, these patterns reveal the limits of engagement. Trying to convince someone who is minimizing your pain that it really mattered often leads to deeper invalidation. When someone is gaslighting, offering more detail or emotional explanation rarely restores truth. It often invites further distortion. These dynamics are not about mutual understanding. They are about self-protection at the expense of another person's psychological safety. For survivors, naming minimization and gaslighting accurately can be a turning point. It shifts the question from, "Why can't I explain this better?" to, "Why does my pain need to be made smaller for them to feel okay?" That shift can restore a sense of grounding and validate what was long dismissed. This is why the topic of the shame narcissists carry after hurting you is not about excusing abuse or asking for empathy for harmful behavior. It is about understanding why accountability feels psychologically intolerable to them. Many narcissistic individuals are not unaware that they caused harm. On some level, they often know. But acknowledging that harm would force them to confront a version of themselves they cannot emotionally tolerate, flawed, vulnerable, or responsible for pain. That confrontation risks collapsing the fragile sense of superiority, innocence, or entitlement that keeps their inner world intact. In this discussion, we'll explore how shame fuels denial, minimization, gaslighting, and the constant externalization of blame. And we'll also talk about why waiting for admissions, insight, or apologies can keep survivors stuck when healing does not require the narcissist's acknowledgement to move forward. Externalization is one of the most consistent ways narcissistic individuals manage shame. When internal responsibility becomes too threatening, it is pushed outward. Rather than holding discomfort inside and reflecting on it, the narcissistic system relocates that discomfort onto someone else. Blame shifting, projection, and character attacks are not random reactions. They are organized strategies that move responsibility away from the self and onto another person, where it feels safer and more controllable. Blame shifting allows the narcissistic individual to redefine cause and effect. Harm is acknowledged only in a distorted way, framed as a reaction rather than an action. "I wouldn't have done that if you hadn't," becomes the organizing logic. This reframing preserves the self-image of being reasonable, justified, or even morally superior. Projection takes this a step further by assigning unwanted traits, selfishness, cruelty, dishonesty, to the very person who was harmed. What cannot be tolerated internally is identified externally, making the narcissist feel cleaner and more coherent. Character attacks often emerge when these defenses are challenged. Rather than engaging with a specific behavior, the focus shifts to the survivor's supposed flaws, motives, or stability. This tactic changes the subject entirely. If the survivor can be portrayed as unreasonable, manipulative, or damaged, then their account of harm can be dismissed without examination. the shame is successfully deflected, and the narcissistic individual remains psychologically intact. One particularly confusing aspect of externalization is the narcissist's tendency to cast themselves as the victim after causing harm. This is not simply a lack of empathy, it is a way to reorganize the emotional narrative. Victimhood offers moral protection. If they are the injured party, then accountability becomes unnecessary and even unjust. This role reversal often leaves survivors feeling disoriented and compelled to defend themselves instead of being supported. While externalization may stabilize the narcissistic ego in the short term, it comes at a high relational cost. Trust erodes when responsibility is consistently displaced. Emotional safety disappears when truth is flexible and blame is unpredictable. Over time, relationships become organized around avoiding accusation rather than building connection. The survivor learns that honesty invites attack, and silence becomes a form of self-protection. This understanding is not meant to encourage confrontation or debate. Arguing against externalization often deepens it, as the narcissistic system experiences challenge as further threat. Instead, recognizing the pattern helps survivors make sense of why conversations feel circular and why resolution remains elusive. It clarifies that the problem is not a failure to explain or empathize, but a structural inability on the narcissist's part to hold responsibility without destabilization. Seeing externalization clearly can help survivors step out of roles they never chose, defendant, rescuer, or emotional regulator, and reclaim a more grounded understanding of what is happening. This is why the topic of the shame narcissists carry after hurting you is not about excusing abuse or asking for empathy for harmful behavior. It is about understanding why accountability feels psychologically intolerable to them. Many narcissistic individuals are not unaware that they caused harm. On some level, they often know. But acknowledging that harm would force them to confront a version of themselves they cannot emotionally tolerate, flawed, vulnerable, or responsible for pain. That confrontation risks collapsing the fragile sense of superiority, innocence, or entitlement that keeps their inner world intact. In this discussion, we'll explore how shame fuels denial, minimization, gaslighting, and the constant externalization of blame. And we'll also talk about why waiting for admissions, insight, or apologies can keep survivors stuck when healing does not require the narcissist's acknowledgement to move forward. A genuine apology is not just a set of words. It requires emotional accountability, the capacity to reflect on one's impact, and the ability to hold empathy for another person without immediately defending the self. For narcissistic individuals, these requirements pose a profound threat to identity. Their sense of self is often organized around a false self, an internal structure built on superiority, control, specialness, or moral infallibility. Admitting harm would destabilize that structure from the inside. To truly apologize, someone must tolerate seeing themselves as flawed without disintegrating. They must be able to say, "I hurt you," without adding justification, deflection, or counterattack. For narcissistic personalities, this level of self-exposure activates shame at an intensity that feels unmanageable. The apology is not experienced as repair. It is experienced as collapse. If the false self cracks, there is often no stable, integrated core beneath it to take its place. This helps explain why many apologies in narcissistic dynamics feel hollow or confusing. Performative apologies are designed to manage image, restore access, or regain control, not to acknowledge impact. They may sound polished, dramatic, or even emotional, but they avoid true responsibility. Common markers include conditional language, quick reversals, or an immediate expectation of forgiveness. The focus subtly shifts from the harm caused to how quickly the situation can be smoothed over. Authentic accountability, by contrast, requires consistency over time. It shows up in changed behavior, respect for boundaries, and a willingness to tolerate discomfort without retaliation. This level of accountability threatens the narcissistic system because it removes the protections that keep shame at bay. Without those defenses, the individual would have to confront vulnerability they have spent a lifetime avoiding. It's also important to understand that when narcissistic individuals do apologize, it is often situational rather than transformative. Apologies may appear when there is something to gain: public image, access to resources, or the prevention of abandonment. Once that goal is achieved, the underlying patterns typically remain unchanged because the structure driving them has not been addressed. Recognizing that the absence of accountability is structural rather than circumstantial can be sobering, but it is also clarifying. It shifts the focus away from trying to find the right words, the right timing, or the right amount of patience. It helps survivors understand that the lack of apology is not a reflection of their worth or the legitimacy of their pain, but a limitation in the other person's psychological capacity. This is why the topic of the shame narcissists carry after hurting you is not about excusing abuse or asking for empathy for harmful behavior. It is about understanding why accountability feels psychologically intolerable to them. Many narcissistic individuals are not unaware that they caused harm. On some level, they often know. But acknowledging that harm would force them to confront a version of themselves they cannot emotionally tolerate, flawed, vulnerable, or responsible for pain. That confrontation risks collapsing the fragile sense of superiority, innocence, or entitlement that keeps their inner world intact. In this discussion, we'll explore how shame fuels denial, minimization, gaslighting, and the constant externalization of blame. And we'll also talk about why waiting for admissions, insight, or apologies can keep survivors stuck, when healing does not require the narcissist's acknowledgement to move forward.